Starting with the raid on Lindisfarne in the year 793, early medieval England faced near constant attacks from the Scandinavian warbands known as the Vikings. Initially aimed at the largely undefended villages and monasteries teeming with gold and valuable Christian goods, the size and scope of these invasions grew over the decades, eventually culminating in the Great Heathen Army of the 860s and 70s, which attempted to conquer all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms which dotted the land. This invasion was eventually stopped in the south by King Æthelred the Great, King of Wessex and first king of the Anglo-Saxons, who despite being pushed back to the Somerset marshes, managed to repulse the warlord Guthrum at the decisive 878 Battle of Edington. His successors went on to fight several wars over the Danelaw, which was established in the north and west, eventually unifying all of the Anglo-Saxons into the Kingdom of England. While succeeding in repelling the pagan Vikings in their wars for conquest, the raiding continued throughout the period, even after the conversions of the Scandinavian rulers and their kingdoms to Christianity. The situation would eventually culminate in catastrophe for the English kings during the rule of Æthelred II, known to history as the Unready, in the early 11th century, paving the way for a successful Danish takeover of England. The nature of the Danish victory is more complex than a simple conquest, however, blending military success with changing English attitudes and allegiances, a mix which allowed for the Christian Vikings of the 11th century to do what their pagan forebears had failed to do, which was only possible as a consequence of the turbulent reign of King Æthelred, whose attempts to buy off and then repel the Vikings led to immense bloodshed, the alienation and eventual desertion of both of his nobles and subjects, civil war, and his twice downfall. Æthelred was born sometime in the late 960s to King Edgar of England and his wife Aelfrith. According to William of Malmesbury 200 years after the fact, his life began with foreshadowing for the troublesome period to come. During his baptism, Æthelred reportedly emptied his bowels while still in the water, to which Archbishop Dunstan of Canterbury angrily declared that Æthelred would be an indolent and ineffective man. Despite being the second surviving son of the king, the succession of his elder brother Edward was not secure. Edward was the child of a previous relationship of the king, with it not clear if the boy had been born out of wedlock or not. In any case, Æthelred's mother Aelfrith pushed for her son's claim over his elder brother, which complicated the line of succession by the time of King Edgar's death in 975. Both children were underaged at the time and thus merely figureheads to the two factions which popped up to support them. The cause of Edward's claim was taken up by Archbishop Dunstan, perhaps never forgiving the boy for the incident during his baptism, while Æthelred was supported by Aelfrith, as well as the immensely influential reformist Bishop Æthelwold of Winchester. These two influential figures failed to win out against the unparalleled influence that Dunstan wielded as Archbishop at the time, who drew support amongst the noblemen of the King's Council, as well as the age difference between the two, Æthelred being a young boy while his brother was already a teenager, and Edward was thus eventually chosen as king after several days of debate. Aelfrith refused to concede defeat, however, and Edward's reign would be tragically cut short as a direct result of her scheming. The 3 years that Edward reigned as king saw a wave of violence and discontent erupt throughout the kingdom between the two factions, with Edward's painted as representing the anti-monastic reformers who opposed the reforms of Edgar's reign, which broke up monastic marriages, and these tensions boiled over in the year 978. Edward went to see his younger brother in Dorset, but was assassinated upon his arrival. Whether or not Aelfrith arranged for the murder of her stepson is uncertain, but she certainly profited from his early departure from life, as it cleared the path to kingship for her underage son. Æthelred was crowned a year later, his deceased brother who was pushed aside in the name of court intrigue venerated and made into a saint. Edgar's reign had seen the final unification of all of England, expelling the last Viking kings of York. This gave the kingdom time to rebuild, leading to a relative abundance of prosperity for the realm, both economically and in terms of population size, with increased urbanization occurring around villages and the burhs established by Alfred and his successors. This path of peace and prosperity was initially continued during Æthelred's reign by his regents, who were led by Bishop Æthelwold. Their period of control saw a marked increase in Viking raids compared to Edgar's reign, however, which served as a sign of things to come. Their grasp on power was broken with the passing of Bishop Æthelwold in 984. Æthelred would have been a teenager by this point, anxious to assume his own control, and the death gave him an opportunity to free himself of his final remaining regent. He quickly dispensed with his mother, allowing his rule to begin in earnest. Æthelred's first move was to marry the daughter of Ealdorman Thored of York, Ælfgifu, an alliance which firmly broke with the reformist faction of his former regents. The couple would go on to produce many children, including his sons Ethelstan and Edmund. With the king now firmly placed on the side opposed to the centralized church in England created by Æthelwold and Dunstan, he shifted abbeys once more away from the powers of the bishoprics to under his noble allies, with the passing of Archbishop Dunstan in 988 removing the last significant figure in Æthelred's early reign in opposition to his royal prerogative. Now without the counsel of these foremost churchmen and statesmen that his father had enjoyed, the prosperity that they had helped grow once again attracted the attention of Scandinavian raiders as it had centuries earlier, with the renewed Viking attacks after Edgar's death rapidly increasing in size and occurrence. The English were initially able to drive back these warbands which their forefathers had grown accustomed to fighting and overcoming time and time again, but this success was not passed down to Æthelred's generation. A massive party landed in the year 991 under the command of a man named Olaf Tryggvason, sailing with 93 ships and raiding across southeastern England. Eventually stopping in August near a place called Malden, they were met in battle on the 11th by the forces of the Ealdorman of Essex, Byrhtnoth, who refused to pay them the demanded tribute. The valiance of the English soldiers at the Battle of Malden, celebrated in the renowned Old English poem of the same name, was unfortunately not enough to overcome the Vikings, with the Ealdorman slain in the fighting. Immediately, their failure at Malden shattered the spirits of the English, once more under threat of their goods being stolen, their lands ravaged, and their lives taken by the warriors of the north. Æthelred's personal image was greatly damaged as well due to his aversion to standing with his subjects in battle, preferring to delegate the task of generalship to his noblemen. The magisterial importance he put on his own life was unheard of for an early medieval English king, causing great controversy within the bellicose nobility, striking a blow to the king's popularity which would continue in subsequent battles. He was also forced to pay off the Vikings with a tribute of 10,000 pounds to stop raiding, a tactic occasionally used since King Alfred and recommended by the new Archbishop Cedric, but would have terrible ramifications for the kingdom during the reign of Æthelred, exposing England as an easy target. The defeat, combined with impending millennialist fears of the end of the world around the year 1000, was interpreted by the king as a result of divine retribution for turning his back on Æthelwold at the beginning of his reign, and so he took steps to win back God's favor. He thus turned his back on many of the anti-reformist noblemen he had surrounded himself with as a young man, instead bringing his mother back to court. Along with several other noblemen he bestowed his favor on, including a man named Elfhelm, who he made Ealdorman of York, replacing his father-in-law. He also sought to undo the damage he caused to the reformers and their centralized power, returning previously requisitioned monastic lands. Rather than being satisfied with their massive tribute, Olaf's host instead extracted as much as they could from England in the following years, ravaging far and wide on stolen horseback, even unsuccessfully attempting to siege London itself. Witnessing this widespread rampage across his lands, Æthelred decided to instead parley with the Viking leader, gifting him massive amounts of goods and money. Perhaps feeling it acceptable to ally with the raiders due to their purported Christian faith, he chose against attempting to drive them away, and instead granting the large and hated force amnesty, and offering to hire them as mercenaries, a proposition which was gladly accepted by the Vikings, who were paid a massive 22,000 pounds. Olaf himself decided that he had gained enough from England, returning home to Norway to become king, leaving behind much of his force to serve as soldiers under Æthelred. While it is believed that his father Edgar had done the same thing during his reign, and the Duchy of Normandy and Francia had been established by Vikings in the 10th century, the policy was admittedly hit or miss, judging on the historical authenticity of the myth of the coming of the Anglo-Saxons themselves to Britain, with Hengist and Horsa as mercenaries under the British King Vortigern in the 5th century, which did not end too well for him or his people. Æthelred did not learn this lesson from his nation's purported early history, however, and the force of perhaps several thousands that he recruited proved too expensive to keep satisfied and supplied, despite increased royal efforts to extract greater levels of taxation for this reason, known as the Dane Geld. The mercenary strategy backfired spectacularly. In 997, a contingent of the Viking force decided that they had had enough of being peacefully paid by the English, instead preferring to slaughter them before getting paid, and so attacked up and down England for much of the next 4 years, defeating several English armies, and resting across the Channel in Normandy, in violation of a treaty agreed to between Æthelred and the Norman Duke. They also failed to spare religious centers like the Abbey at Tavistock, which they burned to the ground. In 1001 they landed at Devon, where they were met by a force of the remaining richly gifted mercenaries, who immediately turned on Æthelred and joined the Vikings, defeating the English in battle. Forced once again to pay a monstrous tribute of 24,000 pounds, Æthelred chose to swing his strategy in the completely opposite direction, meeting the destructiveness of the Vikings with a massive wave of bloodshed of the innocent. In the year 1002, apparently fearing another large-scale uprising, Æthelred allegedly ordered the death of every Danish man in England, an act known to history as St. Brice's Day Massacre. The interpretation of this order found in the open-ended wording of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle has been a matter of great debate for historians, with it now believed likely that the extermination was directed at the remaining mercenary force, rather than some or all of the citizens known to have been of Norse descent extending back to the initial Danelaw settlement. Wholesale extermination is rather improbable, given the sheer number of Danish settlers who had come over in the preceding century, whose removal would wipe out much of the eastern population, but it is clear that the extermination harmed at least those mercenaries who had decided to remain loyal to the English, rewarded with execution for their service, with several mass graves being dug up in recent years confirming the deaths. Rather than solving his Viking issues, the massacre instead greatly angered those in Scandinavia, who would not let the injustice of their fallen kinsmen stand. King Sweyn of Denmark, who had successfully established himself as the foremost ruler in Scandinavia, extending his realm into Norway, soon responded to Æthelred's provocation, sailing with his army to England in 1003. The English force raised to meet them retreated before battle could commence, highlighting the collapsing morale in England in the face of unending defeats, and Sweyn ravaged across the south of England for the next year, destroying the burhs in his path. Finally, an East Anglian force met Sweyn in battle in 1004, and while he emerged victorious, the battle was hard fought and costly for the Danes, and Sweyn returned to his kingdom in 1005, as England entered into a massive famine known as the Great Hunger, continuing the never-ending troubles that the kingdom faced at the turn of the millennium. Amidst the increased bloodshed, Æthelred was also hit with marital loss, his wife Ælfgifu dying sometime in the late 990s. Failing to deal with the Viking safe haven in Normandy by military means after a failed English raid which was overcome by the Norman cavalry, he instead utilized his newfound bachelorness to establish good relations with the duchy, marrying the duke's sister Emma. This newfound relationship tying England and Normandy would have a profound effect on the future of Anglo-Saxon history, both in the short and long term, with the birth of a son named Edward around the year 1005. The king also had to deal with the passing of his mother around the same time, and for yet another time he chose a new faction to favor as his counselors, with several of the most prominent members of the former clique either being sent to a monastery, blinded, or just outright slain. At the head of this new faction were the important Archbishop Wulfstan of York and the newly made Ealdorman of Mercia, Ædric the Grabber. This realignment heralded yet another massive Viking raid in 1006, which the assembled English army failed to oppose, and they thus rampaged throughout the south for a year until yet another tribute was paid, the existing military strength of England clearly failing to properly defend the kingdom yet again. A military and infrastructure revitalization was launched, with new taxes being levied to pay for a new royal fleet to fight the Vikings before they could land, creating the largest Anglo-Saxon fleet up to that point in history when it was amassed in 1009. Perhaps as a result of his murderously craven solutions and fickle policies thus far, and despite the penance demanded of the people by Wulfstan, divine favor still yet eluded the king and his massive fleet. A feud boiled over between a royal counselor named Retake, brother to the prominent Ædric, and a nobleman named Wulfnoth who was accused of disloyalty to the king. Wulfnoth in return appropriated the Viking tactics that the ships were created to oppose, taking 20 of them and launching raids on his fellow Englishmen. Retake sailed off with 80 more ships to deal with the renegade noble, but his ships were caught in a devastating storm, with the remaining ships destroyed by Wulfnoth after. With most of his fleet destroyed before any Vikings had come to fight them, the initiative was doomed, proving to instead have been a massive waste of time, resources, and sorely needed coinage, with the constant tribute payments doing irreparable damage to royal finances. Soon after the naval fiasco, another massive Viking raid was launched, led by a man named Thorkel the Tall, which unoriginally raided and exacted tribute in the south. Fasting was ordered to be observed throughout the kingdom in the days leading up to Michaelmas, before everyone was to walk barefoot in procession to church. Æthelred also finally gave in to the pressure and personally led the newly raised army. This proved to be to their detriment, however, as the force was kept from actually fighting the Vikings, who were allowed to continue raiding into 1010, defeating another army and sacking many prominent settlements over several months unopposed before returning to their ships of their own accord. Æthelred had completely failed to protect his people or their lands in his own cravenness, with him failing to protect his kingship with any of the expected level of resolve, allowing the imminent threat to go on never-endingly rather than defending his own place at the helm of England. Even the fallback plan to pay off the men who had slain so many failed, the treasury straining before enough of the promised tribute of an unimaginable amount of 48,000 pounds could be paid, and so the raiding commenced yet again in 1011, the doom spiral unable to be overcome. Canterbury was their next target, and amongst the prizes won in the ensuing looting was the Archbishop himself, Æthelred. The previously agreed tribute was finally paid after this symbolically significant defeat, but the Vikings demanded more for the Archbishop's release, which Æthelred demanded not be paid. This angered a group of his Christian captors, who in turn chose to commit a rather sinful act, slaying the Archbishop of Canterbury via an axe wound. Thorkel himself was likely not behind this decision, however, which perhaps explained why after the tribute was paid and much of the Viking force had dispersed back to Scandinavia, he and his remaining men were hired as mercenaries by Aethelred, who had still somehow not learned his lesson from a decade prior, putting yet another strain on royal finances. Recognizing the impossible situation that Aethelred now found himself in, King Sweyn of Denmark launched a second invasion of England in 1012, this time with the goal of seizing power entirely. The anger against Aethelred in the kingdom was now palpable, with it clear to many of his subjects that he simply was unable to salvage the situation despite the continually increasing level of royal taxation. This made Sweyn, a man who had looted across England less than a decade prior, appear as a safer alternative, a man who was at least willing to fight for what he wanted. Sweyn traveled through the former Danelaw where his son, a young man named Cnut, was married to an English noblewoman named Ælfgifu, daughter and sister to the nobles previously murdered and blinded in the last council purge, indicating support for Sweyn by the factions sidelined by Aethelred earlier in his reign. Northumbria, Lincolnshire, and the Five Boroughs near immediately submitted to Sweyn, perhaps illustrating that he had been invited to the north by the nobleman. Town after town fell to his advance, before Sweyn eventually made his way to London, the bastion and residence of Aethelred. Sweyn was initially repulsed from the city, both by the people of London and the River Thames itself, with the forces of Thorkel temporarily remaining loyal to Aethelred. Sweyn chose instead to travel west to Bath, receiving its submission. With even the lands of Wessex, home of Alfred the Great, joining with the invading Danish force, the Londoners finally saw the writing on the wall and submitted to Sweyn, and Aethelred chose to join Thorkel at his camp outside of the city. Sending his Norman family across the Channel, the king and his mercenaries first went to the Isle of Wight, before he too went into exile in Normandy, finally giving up his crown, and Sweyn was crowned as the Danish King of England at the end of 1013. Just as the matter seemed finally settled against Aethelred, the winds of fortune which had eluded citizen Wessex throughout his reign turned towards him for once. Sweyn unexpectedly died on the 3rd of February of 1014, allegedly slain by Saint Edmund, long before martyred by the Danes, which opened England up to the potential of bloody dynastic squabbling. A noble assembly at York headed by Archbishop Wulfstan decided that it had been sinful to turn against their divinely chosen monarch, and chose to send for Aethelred to be king once more, on the condition that he would be a better and more just king than he had been during his first reign. He gladly accepted these demands, and was named King of England once more. Once again joined by Thorkel's mercenaries, and having hired a force under the command of a man named Olaf Haraldsson, Aethelred sent them to attack the Danish force under Sweyn's son Cnut, which it had named as king. The battle was a victory for the English side, and Cnut was forced to flee with his remaining men back to Denmark, leaving behind severely disfigured noble hostages collected by his father. Aethelred's second reign would prove slightly shorter in length than his first, but with about the same level of success. The king's eldest son, Aethelstan, died shortly after his father's return, leaving the line of succession to his next eldest surviving son, Edmund. Aethelstan had stood in opposition to the prominent councillor Edric, who soon after Aethelstan's death arranged for the murder of two of his close allies, sons of a nobleman Edric had slain a decade prior, one of whose widow was to be sent to a convent. This act proved too far for Edmund, who took up the cause championed by his brother, instead marrying the soon-to-be nun, and rose up in rebellion in the Five Boroughs in August of 1015. Any luck that Aethelred had left ran out at this point, with Cnut returning from his lands in Scandinavia to claim back the kingdom briefly conquered by his father. Aethelred and Edmund attempted to come back together to face the Danish threat together, but illness left Edric in charge of Aethelred's forces, which Edmund refused to stay connected with Edric as leader. Edric proved his unsavory reputation well-founded, as he betrayed Aethelred despite all the stature granted to him, with it believed that he took Thorkel's force with him to join up with Cnut. The lands of Wessex were forced to submit to Cnut as king, and he moved into Mercia, with the morale of the remaining English force collapsing as a result of the king's inability to remain at its head. The Earl of Northumbria also submitted to Cnut, before almost immediately being executed, and the English side was yet again reduced to the area around London for the second time in 2 years. Aethelred died on the 23rd of April of 1016, after nearly 40 years as King of England. His reign saw the complete reversal of English fortunes that were seen during the reign of his father, with never-ending Viking raids after a century of English successes against them finally succeeding in conquering the whole kingdom more than once, a feat not even accomplished in the dark days following the raid on Alfred at Chippenham in 878. Edmund was chosen as king by those who had remained loyal in London, upon which he did what his father never could, leading his army into several battles. The subsequent 4 battles were all victories for the English side, proving the Danish force far from invincible, and the new king was able to seize back control over Wessex, and even Æthelred switched sides once again in what must have been a desperate move to remain relevant. Despite these victories, a single loss stopped the reinvigorated English side in their tracks, however, and Edmund was defeated in his 5th battle against the Danes in October at the Battle of Ashdown. Edmund managed to barely escape with his life, and peace was finally agreed to, with England divided once again between Wessex and a reborn Danelaw. Tragically, Edmund appears to have likely sustained grievous wounds in the fighting, cutting his life and reign short before the end of the year. This slightly justified the cravenness of his father, as with no one left to champion the English cause, the Danes under Cnut were left unopposed. Finally, England could know peace, the turbulent period at the beginning of the 1000s coming to a close. Despite finally falling to the Danes, their 2 victories were in tandem with the English nobility rather than in opposition. The conversion of the Scandinavians to Christianity meant that it became acceptable to view them as replacements for the kingship, a fact which was exacerbated by Aethelred's inability to get any semblance of a handle on the situation. While certainly being dealt a bad hand, Aethelred failed to aid his situation in any way, unwilling to put his own life on the line in the defense of his kingdom, while still expecting his noblemen to do just that. The inordinate amount of taxes raised for the unpopular and unsuccessful policy of paying off and even hiring the raiding Vikings as mercenaries drained royal finances, squandering the prosperity gained from Edgar's reign. Aethelred chose time and time again to completely upend whatever faction was at the top, always managing to alienate or even assassinate them on the way out, ending up with disloyal and hated men like Æthelred, which drove a wedge between the English side when they needed unity above all else. Ultimately, it was the loss of any support of his nobility, combined with the military setbacks inflicted by the Danes, that deprived the Anglo-Saxons of the kingship of their own realm. The bond established between England and Normandy through Æthelred's marriage to Emma would also unwittingly begin the chain of events that would eventually lead to the end of Anglo-Saxon England decades later. For the time being, however, King Cnut stood at the head of a vast Danish empire stretching across the North Sea, which he would spend the next 3 decades ruling over, attempting to cement his dynasty as rulers of England. Æthelred's son Edward, however, carried in his blood the royal house of Wessex, which had ruled England since its inception under Alfred the Great, and he would not give up his claim easily. England now stands at peace, but its future is tenuous, under the grip of a new Viking dynasty. Thank you to Tanya Dennis for joining on Patreon.